How did Richard Ebeling and I discover libertarianism? Join Richard and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. I am Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings y'all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I am joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners for another session.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're brand new to FFF, you're discovering us with this video, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily for around 34 years of principled arguments on liberty. So, Richard, every week we discuss a particular issue in the context of libertarian principles. And I thought we'd change things around a little bit this week and talk about how we both discovered libertarianism. One of the things that I really enjoy doing whenever I'm at conferences or conventions or whatever is asking people, how did you discover libertarianism? And each person's story is almost always very fascinating. And it's usually an indirect discovery. That is, it wasn't because somebody came and buttonholed them and said, here, let me tell you about libertarianism. It was more of, I discovered libertarianism because I saw a book or I heard a speech or I saw somebody making a presentation on it. And then, all the light bulbs went out and went on. And so I thought, well, okay, let's you and me give our story about how we discovered libertarianism. We've done this indirectly in the past, but I figured let's devote a show to how it was that you and I ended up really devoting our lives, our careers, everything to the libertarian philosophy. So why don't you go first, and then
I'm going to go first. Okay.
yeah, I'm going to honor you with you go first this week.
Okay. Well, I'll make it short. It'll be a 5-hour Fidel Castro speech. Don't worry. Well, as I usually tell this story, I became a libertarian on the day I was born. The doctor grabbed me by my feet, turned me upside down, slapped my bottom, and I shouted out and cried. And at that moment, I realized that he had violated the non-aggression principle. Did he ask me if he could slap my little bottom? No, he just did it. And I realized that from that point on, there was something wrong when one person violated the rights of others. And really, the rest is history. So now you can tell your story, Jacob. Okay. Actually, I have a feeling that some viewers and listeners might not believe that. Anyway, so what really happened was when I was in my early and mid-teens, I was already a nerd. I liked to read. I liked history. I liked public affairs, uh, current events. And so I used to read a bunch of that on my own. And so much so that when I was in high school, the girls already called me the professor. That was deadly. It meant, Jacob, I was going to be a very lonely guy on a Friday and Saturday night when the girls already call you the professor. Jacob, I was such a lonely guy. Oh. No, but anyway, so though I was alone, I was doing a lot of reading. Um, and really what happened was that I had a part-time job after school when I was in high school. And in the Hollywood Public Library, I was living in Hollywood, California. And part of my job was to take care of the magazine collection on a balcony. Unfortunately, the building has since burned down, but it was a great Art Deco style building. And the balcony had the magazine collection. My job was to put away new issues that came in or reshelve issues that people using the library had asked to see. And I would hide up there and I would read political magazines on the left, on the right. At that time, on the left with things like New Republic, The Nation. On the right, it was not very many, but it was like Human Events, National Review. Uh, and I was very torn because the left would always appeal to my heart. Justice, fairness, the poor. And then the conservatives, they would be like saying, it costs money and it doesn't work. And those commies, they seem to kill a lot of people. So my heart, my head, I was so confused. And so one day I had been in a used bookstore along Hollywood Boulevard. And on my way home, I had stopped at a restaurant called Hodie's Restaurant, alas, no longer there, at the corner of Hollywood and Vine. And I sat on a stool at the counter between these two guys. And I later found out these two guys had an act. They would leave a stool open between them, and like the fly being caught by the spiders, they would try to talk to people and induct them into thinking. And so one of them started a conversation and said, "Have you ever heard of Ayn Rand?" And I said, "Of course, I've heard the Rand Corporation, but what the hell is an Ayn?" And after talking with me for a while, they whipped out a copy of Rand's collection of nonfiction essays, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And by the way, this is all a true story. They said, "We want you to read this and come back in 3 days." And so I did. And her case for what is capitalism, eye-opening things about individual rights, uh, debunking many of the myths about the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, and so on and so forth. So I come back in 3 days and I returned the book. It was a paperback copy. And they then hand me her other collection of nonfiction essays, The Virtue of Selfishness. And they say, "Read this and come back in 3 days." And I do again. Now, this has been a revelation. Her case for rational self-interest, the moral right of the individual to keep the peaceful and honest products of his labor, both physical and mental, and that human relationships should be based upon voluntary agreement and consent, and no one should be compelled or sacrificed to serve the interests of others, especially through the brutal coercion of the state. So I've now been really turned on by this, and so we talk, and I return the book to them, and now the other one hands me a paperback copy of Atlas Shrugged, and my heart sinks, Jacob, because anyone who knows, this is like a 1,000-page novel, and I just know they're going to say 3 days. As I like to say, I swept the sweat from my brow when they said, "Come back in 10 days." And so I read it, and I read John Galt's speech twice. And again, this is revelatory. And now what happened was they said, "Well, you can attend tape lectures about her philosophy." There's this organization called the Nathaniel Branden Institute. It was still active and alive then in the 1960s. And they had representatives around the country in different cities. And they had taped presentations of the lectures that were being given at the actual Nathaniel Branden Institute in New York City. And they had this, like, I think once every 2 weeks or something, in a building at the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Highland Boulevard. And so I started attending those with these two guys. And by the way, who were these two guys? One was a substitute school teacher, high school teacher. And his mission, because what does a substitute teacher do? Goes in because some regular teacher is sick for a couple of days. You're just sort of babysitting, not much of a lesson plan. So his purpose was to go in there as a substitute teacher and indoctrinate these young minds in his philosophy. He was like on a mission from God. And the other one was just a house painter who had no front teeth. He had lost them in high school playing hockey. I mean, these were these two objectivists. Anyway, so I started attending these lectures, and in the middle of the lectures, there'd be a break. Go to the restroom, get a cup of coffee, and there was on display a bookshelf of books that Ayn Rand thought were worth reading, recommended. And that's where I first discovered Henry Hazlitt, Ludwig von Mises, Frederick Bastiat, Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, and so on, as well as her other own books. And those she recommended. Arthur E. Kirch's The Decline of American Liberalism, a great book on the ideas of the American Revolution and how they were undermined as the 19th and the 20th century progressed. But anyway, so that turned me on to this. And that's basically how I got into this. Now, I started reading the economics because I wanted, as Ayn Rand would call, intellectual ammunition to defend her moral case for liberty. But after a while, I just found the economics interesting in itself. So I was reading more of Mises, and then I came into contact somehow through the Freeman. I found out about the Freeman magazine, and I got in communication, correspondence, the old snail mail, obviously back then, with Bettina Bien-Graves, who was a senior staff member there, and a Mises devotee. And then she started sending me more books, sending me more names. That's how I found about Hayek's Road to Serfdom. And I just became absorbed in this stuff. So by the time I went to college, I decided I wanted to major in economics and just pursue these ideas. Never did I have more than a rude awakening when I took my first economics class in college, with the textbook being the Keynesian economist's Paul Samuelson's quote economics, the seventh edition. And I said, this is not like the economics I've been reading from Mises and Hayek and these others, or Henry Hazlitt. And so that was a trying and traumatic experience to realize that what I thought was economics was not what the mainstream of the economics profession thought was economics. But I then did a stint in the Naval Reserves. It was during the Vietnam War. My induction number was rather low. I was clearly going to be drafted, so I went into the Naval Reserves, serving in San Diego, and when I got out of the reserves, I decided to get serious and go back to college. And so I then finished my undergraduate degree at California State University at Sacramento, in which all of my professors were either Keynesians, or for those who might be aware of this, Thorstein Veblen type institutionalists, and then Stalinist Marxists, not just Marxists, but I had these two professors who believed that the world was a sadder place since Joseph Stalin had died. And the only two heroes to look up to for the hope of the world was Chairman Mao in China and Enver Hoxha, the communist, dogmatic, extreme tyrant of Albania. These were their heroes. So those were my professors as an undergraduate. So I would go hiding in the library, again, not going to football games, no dates. And just reading old economics journals and any other publication in which I could discover these classical liberal and Austrian economic ideas. And so that was the origin of this. I should mention one other thing here, that a major event that was personally very important and influential to me, which happened 50 years ago this June. That was in June 1974. I had met through some mutual friends the founder and then president of the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, then headquartered in Menlo, California. I was living in Sacramento. I went down to Menlo Park with my two friends. They introduced me to Baldy Harper, Floyd Harper, and a couple of his associates, explaining my independent discovery of Austrian economics and free market thinking and philosophy of individualism. And so it must have stuck with them. Baldy Harper passed away. These colleagues became the caretakers to run IHS. Ken Templeton and George Pearson, through the financial assistance of Charles Koch, to keep it alive. And I got invited to attend the first Austrian economics conference in South Royalton, Vermont, in a week of June 1974. In fact, since we're talking about this, here is the original brochure from 1974. This is 50 years old, Jacob, right? 50 years old. It was held on June 15th to June 22nd. And there's the inside. Who were the speakers? I'd been reading these people, but I had never met them before, Jacob, right? This was going to be a major event for me. Israel Kirzner, Murray Rothbard, and Ludwig Lockmann. Lockmann was a free market Austrian-oriented economist who had studied at the University of Berlin, but being Jewish, he left Germany in 1933, went to the London School of Economics, and earned a second master's degree under Hayek, who was then at the London School of Economics. Anyway, so these are the speakers. I went to this. And so that was a major intellectual and personal event for me, because now I met some of these people who later became, remember at this time, 50 years ago, they were in graduate school. A few of us, like myself, were still finishing undergraduate degrees. One or two were starting to teach. These were young unknowns. Many of them became, over the last half century, prominent members of the revival and reawakening of the Austrian School of Economics. So that was a major event. And then I went to do my graduate studies, which reinforced these things. And then, to make a long story short, I ended up after teaching at the University of Dallas in Irving, Texas for a while, where Jacob and I met, I ended up, quite fortunately, being offered the job as the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, a position I held for 15 years. Until then, I accepted a stint at the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, which I did from '03 to '05. And from there, I went to the University of Northwood University in Michigan. And then for the last 10 years, I have been at the Citadel here in Charleston, South Carolina. But this is how I basically came to these ideas that you might ask why. What appeals to these ideas? Well, as I said, it began with Ayn Rand, but there might, there was this libertarian philosopher, thinker, writer, great essayist named Frank Shorterov. And in one of his essays, he says the purpose of teaching libertarianism, the ideas of freedom, is not to make a freedom advocate or a libertarian, but to find them. There has to be something in the person, however, in the back of their mind or their sense of life, that when they hear these ideas or read something, it sort of clicks with them. It lights that match, if you will, that spark. And obviously there was something in me that once I discovered these ideas, it just said, yes, this is right. This is moral. This is just. This is good. This is the way human beings should live. And not only is it the moral and ethical way people should associate and live, my gosh, this free market stuff, it actually delivers the goods. It makes people prosperous and wealthy and to have good lives. Once the free market is left alone for people to freely be creative and innovative in serving each other through the market forces of supply and demand. And in a nutshell, that's how I came to this, Jacob.
Oh, well, fascinating story, Richard, and thanks for sharing it. So mine is somewhat similar, but obviously very different as well. I When I was growing up, Richard, I loved reading. I mean, I was a voracious reader. And then my parents sent me to public schools in my hometown, Laredo, Texas, and it was just I hated the regimentation, and I learned very quickly that you don't get rewarded for reading in public schools. You get rewarded for getting straight A's, and that's where your parents praise you. Oh, let me see your report card. So I ended up orienting toward getting straight A's than reading. Memorizing, studying for the exams. I would have been better off. I have no doubts about it. If my parents had just left me alone at home to read whatever I wanted, and just I would have learned much more because I would have been learning what I wanted to learn. But I was always had this rebellious streak in me. For example, in the seventh grade, the school newspaper. This was a junior high school at Lamar Junior High School in Laredo, named after Marable B. Lamar, the first president of Texas, as an independent nation. Uh, the school newspaper was called the Lion's Roar because we were the Lamar Lions, and it was the most boring newspaper in the world. You fall asleep reading this thing. And so this friend of mine and I started our alternative newspaper called the Weekly Bore, and I handle the business aspects. He was a writer. This guy was ingenious. I mean, I thought that he'd go to work for Mad Magazine. He was so good. And almost immediately, our circulation was bigger than the Lions Roar. We were selling it for like a nickel a copy. Every week we would publish it. And our circulation was soaring. So that gives you an idea of how I felt about the establishment even back then. And then I got into high school, but I was still playing the game. I got elected student council president at Lamar, and then I got elected class president in high school, and then student council president. That was how I met Elvis Presley on a student council trip up to Wisconsin. It was just a happenstance. He happened to be staying at the same hotel. So there were good parts of this, but one of my biggest regrets was that this friend of mine, Cindy West, who later married one of my best friends and tragically died from cancer at around 40 years of age. She says, I got a book I'd like to recommend to you. And she says, it's called Atlas Shrugged. And I said, no, I'm not interested. You see, I'd lost my thirst for learning. And so I passed up this tremendous opportunity, much to my regret, because I would have learned about libertarianism in high school like you did. So I went to college at Virginia Military Institute. My dad had wanted me to go there. The Vietnam War was going strong. He said, you're probably going to have to go. You might as well learn how to fight. And it's a good school. So I go there and I'm buying into all this stuff about, oh, stopping the communist threat and stuff. But I hate the regimentation, but I got a great education. I learned the importance of honor. The honor code at VMI, which is enforced by the Cadet Corps, is very, very powerful. But by the time my junior year comes along, I realize that the Vietnam War is a big crock. And I'm resisting the regimentation, and the administration knows this. And so they demote me my senior year. I was supposed to be a cadet officer. They demote me to a first class private, first class. That's our senior year is called, or we're called first classmen. So I didn't care at that point. But at the end of the year, our valedictorian is elected at VMI, not the person with the highest grade point average. And there's no politicking. Everybody just puts names into a box. And lo and behold, I was stunned. My classmates elected me valedictorian. I mean, it was one of the biggest honors of my life, and I had no idea it was coming. That's the last thing I expected. So now the administration is extremely nervous about me making the valedictory address because the governor is coming in. And they knew at this point that I did not like the regimentation and the Vietnam War. And so they were very nervous. So they sent a representative. The administration said, we'd like to see a copy of your speech before you deliver it. And I said, oh, well, I'm really sorry. I'm still thinking about it in my mind. So I don't have anything written, which was true. And so then I went out and took a weekend off to Richmond or so to work on my speech and stayed away from my room so they could never come and find me before the graduation exercises. So I gave this speech, and I didn't know anything about libertarianism. But if you read the speech, it's very libertarian about if you're going to create responsible people, you have to give them the maximum latitude to make mistakes, to make choices. And that when you have a school that's caring for the students and providing for them and regulating them and controlling them, you're achieving the exact opposite of this. Well, the speech hits the wire. I get a standing ovation from my classmates and from the whole school. And the speech hits the wire services. so in any event, then I end up getting commissioned. I go to infantry school, and then I go to law school. And in law school, I had to drop out to go to infantry school for 3 months. And when I come back, I decided to wait tables in Dallas, where my sister was. I was living with my sister and her husband, waiting to start up school in the winter, the second semester. And I come home and watch the afternoon movie, and the afternoon movie is The Fountainhead. And I'm just mesmerized by this movie. I mean, this, of course, based on Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, and I'm mesmerized. And so I go out and buy the book immediately, but it never occurs to me to look up any more books by her. And so I end up going through law school. I go home and I get involved with representing illegal immigrants. I hated the system of illegal immigrants, and so I was asking the federal judge, appoint me to represent them. I'm going to question the whole constitutionality of this system. And I'm a Democrat. I mean, I grew up as a liberal Democrat, and then one day I go into the public library of Laredo, Texas. And I discover these 4 little books that have been published by the Foundation for Economic Education, where you end up serving as president. And they bowl me over, Richard. It's a road to Damascus experience. I should also mention that prior to that time, I'd read a book called A Time for Truth by William Simon, who was Treasury Secretary under Reagan, where he said, oh, we need to restore freedom to America. And I thought, this is so weird. And I remember telling my friend Jack, who had married that friend of mine, Cindy, I said, Jack, this is really weird. This guy's talking about restoring freedom to America. We are free as Americans. So I had this mindset, like most people do, that we live in a free country. Well, I discovered these 4 books, and that all the indoctrination in the public schools, it's just shattered. And so I start trying to find books written by these authors, and it never occurred to me that FEE was still in existence, because I'd been an economics major at VMI and I'd never heard of this group. So I figured, oh, they went out of business. These books had been published in the 50s. I discovered them in the late 70s. Well, one day I decided to go to Port Aransas, Texas, for a weekend off reading. I found some books by some of the authors there, Mises and Hayek and so forth, Leonard Reed. And so I decided to look for a bookstore, a used bookstore, and so I look in the yellow pages of the telephone book at a pay telephone booth, and I look up bookstores, and there's one that says anti-communism, Americanism, American bookstore. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. So I go over there and but I go around the block thinking this is really weird, but it's a pharmacy. So I said, well, okay, I can walk into a pharmacy, And so I walk into this pharmacy, and over on the right side is the mother lode. There's the Freeman that was being published by the Foundation for Economic Education, current issues. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're still in existence. Then there's Mises, and there's Hayek, and there's Bastiat, and Baldy Harper, who you mentioned. It was the mother lode, and they had dust all over them because nobody was buying them. I bought everything. I mean, I was so excited. I can't tell you how excited I was. My car was filled with these books on libertarianism. And I should mention that prior to that time, I was a trial attorney. All the books I'd been reading were on trial work: direct examination, cross-examination, jury summation. I was reading F. Lee Bailey, who's a famous criminal defense lawyer. My hero was Jerry Spence, who later ended up representing Randy Weaver. And there's a whole different world. But then I discovered libertarianism, and I put all those trial books aside, and I contacted Fee, and I signed up immediately for a seminar, spring seminar, and then signed up for another one for a week-long seminar. And that was the beginning of my journey. And then finally into libertarianism. And finally, I ended up in Dallas. My dad passed away. He and I were law partners. I moved to Dallas. That's where you and I met. And I formed the Mont Dallas Society, named after the Mont Pelerin Society, where we'd get together, 10 or 12 Austrians in Dallas every month, to talk about some aspect of Austrian economics. We were bringing people in. And then one day, I get a call from an out-of-town law firm, big law firm, that they're opening up a Dallas office. They want to talk to me about managing their Dallas office. And at the same time, I get an offer from the Foundation for Economic Education to be their program director in New York. This is the turning point in my life, and I realize this. And so I go to the beach, and I do a lot of soul searching, praying. What should I do? What should I do? I'd been wanting to be a lawyer since I was a kid. But libertarianism was where my heart was. And I said, you got to go where your heart is. And so I contacted all my clients, and I contacted that law firm and said, I'm leaving the law practice. I'm going to New York. And I packed my bags and I moved to New York. And 2 years later, I formed the Future of Freedom Foundation. You were vice president of academic affairs. You helped me put it together. Those were tough times, trying to make it in the first couple of 2 or 3 years, but we did make it, and we've been doing it for 34 years. And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it, Richard.
Well, you said that you would, signed up for a fee seminar. I should mention, just as an aside, because I forgot about it. After I went to that first Austrian economics conference in June of 1974, I had been in communication, as I said, with Bettina Bengraves, and she had written to me, "What are you doing the week after that Austrian economics conference?" I said, "Well, nothing. I'm planning to go back to New York." And she said, "Well, the week immediately after that one, we're having a week-long summer seminar here at Fee. Would you like to attend? I'll arrange for you to have a scholarship." So I went from that Austrian economics conference in South Royalton, Vermont, down to Irvington on Hudson in New York, and spent the whole week there. So that gave me a chance to hear Henry Hazlitt lecture, Hans Senholz lecture, Paul Poirot, who is the editor of the Freeman, Bettina Graves lecture, and of course, most impressively, of course, the founder and longtime president of FEE, Leonard Reed. And by a strange coincidence, one other attendee that week of that FEE seminar in June of 1974 was Lou Rockwell, who later became the founding president of the Mises Institute.
Yeah, well, my experience was the same. I mean, I later wrote an essay for the Freeman called "Leonard Reed Changed My Life." and there has been no bigger influence in my life in terms of libertarianism than Leonard Reed. And so when I
Yeah.
went to that first seminar, to be able to hear him talk, it was like, wow, this is phenomenal. I'd bought all his books, and he always would inscribe a little personal note in his books that he would send you. And he just had such a powerful impact on me. And one time, I was a lawyer, remember, and so I think in terms sometimes of debate, argumentation, and I'm sitting at the lunch table across from Leonard Reed, and they had long tables, as you recall, where all the seminar participants would be eating, but they had little side tables which held only two people. And so it was me sitting across from Leonard Reed, and I remember saying to him, and I was ready to debate. However he answered this question, I was ready to debate the other side. I'm a lawyer, okay? So I said, Mr. Reed, if the people of a area, jurisdiction, community, or whatever, unanimously decide that they want a socialist system, should they be free to implement that socialist system? And I'm ready to argue either side, Richard. And he thinks and he thinks. He finally looks at me, and guess what his answer is? It was the worst possible answer you could ever imagine from my perspective. He looks at me and he says, I don't know. How do you argue with I don't know? Totally unfair here. I was ready to debate him. I don't know.
Well, I know our time is running out, so let me tell one Leonard Reed story, which I know you're familiar with. And that week that free seminar I attended in June of '74, like I said, I heard Henry Hazlitt speak and Hans Sennholz. These are all prominent free market economists of that time. But I remember only one lecture, and it was one of Leonard Reed's lectures. And there was a lecture hall off the library of the old Free Mansion, which unfortunately is no longer there. And at one point, he has someone in the back turn out the lights, and he's holding an electric candle in his hand. And he turns it on so there's just the dimmest imaginable flicker of the electric candle. And he says, notice that in this room of darkness, even this wee bit of light attracts all of our attention. And then he turns the dimmer switch slightly more. And so now he says, notice you see more of the candle itself, and you sort of see me behind the candle. And he turns it up a little bit more. Well, notice now we sort of see the whole front of the room, and a couple of the people, some of the people in the front row. Continues to turn it up until finally it's at the maximum illumination. And he says, look, now just from this little electric candle, virtually the entire room is lit up with just a few dark corners. And he says, that's what each of us can be, a light of liberty. And we become brighter and brighter by the extent that through a process of self-learning and self-education, we improve our own understanding of the philosophy of freedom, the ideas, the applications, practicing and learning methods of articulating it with politeness and courtesy, and never being offensive or attempting to force something on someone that they're not ready to hear. But each of us can then light a spark in one other person and another person and another person until there are enough of us lights of liberty that we will have pushed the darkness of collectivism way into the small corners of society, and we will win. That has stuck with me for 50 years.
I totally agree with you. He gave the same lecture when I was there. And the other thing, I know we need to wrap up, but the other important thing is that Leonard Reed taught us the importance of adhering to principle. I mean, he was the inspiration for my starting the foundation, the Future of Freedom Foundation. And with its principled message, I started out this show by saying we present the principle case because principles are everything. And Leonard said that if you can't really compromise principles, you can only abandon them. And as soon as you abandon them, then you really lose the case for liberty. And this is why we have long held it, even on major socialist programs like Social Security and Medicare and public schooling and the like, that you've got to adhere to principle, because as soon as you abandon the principle, you have abandoned the making the case for the free society. But if people understand the principle involved, then everything else falls into place. And so we've got to adhere to principle if we're going to get freedom in America.
Hear,
On that
hear.
note, we wrap things up, Richard. Hey, I greatly enjoyed the conversation, Richard, and look forward to talking to you next week. And thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support of FFF, and looks forward to next week, Richard.
Until next time.